Members of Parliament have this week called for more to be done to protect whistleblowers. During an African National Congress-sponsored debate, MPs urged the Justice Department to speed up the process of improving its treatment of whistleblowers. For more on this, I am joined by Professor Natasha Holthausen-Dutoit, a professor for public administration and whistleblower expert from the University of Pretoria. A very good evening to you, Prof. The picture for whistleblowers in South Africa is one that might deter any prospect of becoming a whistleblower. If you could just describe the plight of whistleblowers in South Africa currently.
Good evening to you, Masan. Good evening to all your viewers. The reality is that the plight of whistleblowers are quite severe in South Africa. Not only do they face, for example, discrimination, harassment, including what is defined by the Protected Disclosures Act as occupational harassment, but we see in so many instances that either the whistleblowers would leave the country because they fear for their lives, or they lose their lives. So they are murdered, and that is quite a horrific reality for whistleblowers within South Africa.
And John, as you mentioned, the Protected Disclosure Act, and I also want to include the Whistleblower Act, what aren't we doing? Because it clearly seems that we have the paperwork there, we've got the policies in place. Is it again a matter of political will and again a matter of poor implementation?
Also, we definitely have quite a number of acts, which would include the PDA, the Companies Act, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. So the legislation is in place. And although we currently have a amendment bill proposed specifically for whistleblowers, I am not convinced that the problem only lies with the implementation or the lack of political will, depending on if the disclosure that is being made is a reflection on whoever is in that political seat. I think it's also the stigmatization that we have in terms of whistleblowers. And I think that is where we need to really try and change the narrative in terms of being a whistleblower, that a whistleblower is seen as a hero and not just as popularly referred to as an impimpi or a snitch or a snake. So I really think we really need to change the narrative so that it is almost acceptable for people to disclose wrongdoings. And that actually starts much earlier on in our lives.
And speaking about that as well, just it being acceptable to be able to do that, there are those conditions that deter. You spoke about occupational harassment, and that is further explained also in the Protection Disclosure Act. If you could just explain what occupational harassment is and that whistleblowers face.
So occupational, well, detriment specifically, is when a whistleblower would make a disclosure within their place of work, or it might be outside, but normally we would follow internal channels first. And then what happens is that when a disclosure is made, we can find that the person is known, and then they suffer, for example, it could be unfair treatment, which would include being demoted, being sent to another position which they do not want to go to. It includes any kinds of victimization that a person might experience then within the workplace. And just as an add on to that, we often see that those that disclose the wrongdoings often then get accused of the disclosure that they have made. So the wheels are turned on them, and then they are in a position where they basically then have to defend themselves. So there are quite a number of things that would be within occupational detriment, but any kind of victimization, whether it is transfers or harassment within the workplace, also harming people through, for example, social media, those are things that we need to consider.
And speaking about that as well, does that then harm that has been created in that organization then extend to other organizations? Because just from experience of, interviewing former whistleblowers as well, they seem to struggle then to find employment outside of whether it's a government department or even if it's in the private sector as well. And one would think that if you are a whistleblower, you'd be seen as your peers and in your industry as an ethical person, correct? But that doesn't seem to be the case. They seem to suffer a financial knock as well.
They take a huge financial lock, and it's almost as if they are being blacklisted. There's that stigma then that they carry, that they can't be trusted, which is not the truth. I mean, if we look at there are so many cases that we have of whistleblowers, which are basically seen as they are unemployable, they can't find work, and then they have to rely on other organizations to help them, to support them. And then we also should remember that there's a lot of psychological damage that this individual would suffer, including their families.
And would then this suggestion by the DA come in handy here, because they are suggesting an independent whistleblower protection agency. And I assume that in that protection agency, they speak about, it being well-funded as well, that then it would cushion that financial knock for those whistleblowers as well while they aren't able to find jobs, as opposed to being left to their own devices.
So just apart from them not being able to find jobs, they also carry a lot of legal costs. So there are quite a lot of discussions in terms of what would be the best suited type of organization. There are, for example, calls for the Office of Public Integrity. There is the Anti-Corruption Commission. So there are a number of bodies that are being suggested. But the common theme in all of them is that it should be a Chapter 9 institution. So that's constitutionally established. But that would also mean that the constitution has to be changed. But then also in terms of these bodies, that they should also have powers. So powers to investigate, powers to prosecute, almost similar to what the SUI is doing. But then also considering then how do we then help these individuals, and that would be financial kind of an incentive. So whether it would be going from a reward for blowing the whistle or financial support. I know, for example, Whistleblower House currently, they are supporting families, not with a lot of money, but they are supporting these individuals that are seen to be unemployable.
Yeah, and also just in terms of the suggestions that were made in Parliament as well, it was Rise Mzansi leader Songezo Zibi who suggested that employers should be prohibited from disciplining officials who make these protected disclosures. Now, Prof, earlier you were saying that sometimes they do that and then it's retaliated and turned back on them as well.
Yes.
How then can we use then policy to ensure that we don't have that happen? And should we be able to amend our policies when it comes to that? How long will it take before it actually trickles down to to the ground where it can be felt?
Once we have, so even with the PDA and with the amended to it and all the legislation that is currently being considered, remember that policies can be changed quicker. So I think the responsibility, and here we need to take a page from the United Nations in terms of the requirements, and they clearly state the requirements. Also, the Europeans, they, for example, also, if we consider the European Directive on Whistleblowing, they specifically call that a person should not be, for example, their employment should not be terminated while whatever is being investigated is being investigated. So it would be easier for us to build that into our policies already. But obviously, we would really have to have an act that are more specific in terms of aspects that relates to that kind of protection to our whistleblowers so that they don't lose their jobs while they are, the disclosure that they made are being investigated.
And before I let you go, I mean, we did talk about the plight of whistleblowers being either they're having to move away, of course, there's financial burden as well. But in the worst case scenario, you've got those who are murdered and die. For instance, Babita Deokaran. Now, when we look at that case in particular, the masterminds behind her killing are still not known and are still not caught yet. So if that is the case, how much of a deterrent is it for anyone else who is thinking of blowing the whistle when they think of the fact that they could be killed and those responsible for it won't even be brought to book?
Maswa, to be honest, those that blow the whistle really do it because they want to do the right thing. And because it's not as if they do not know, especially after Babita. And we've seen that a lot of people decided they not to blow the whistle because they are afraid of their lives. So I think if we can have a really robust system where we are protecting whistleblowers, it would change. But I also firmly believe that we need to have an organizational culture change where it is acceptable to blow the whistle so that whistleblowing is seen as another internal control mechanism and not as the whistleblowers. Ireland, for example, are now not including the term whistleblowing in their legislation or proposed bill that they are currently working on. So I think it is, as I've started off by saying, change the narrative and make it acceptable. So a cultural change, an organizational culture change, and even with us as citizens, we tell our children not to tell stories, but then we expect people to tell stories, and I am using that term very loosely, later in life. But we were constantly told, do not tell stories, do not be a snitch.
Yeah, culture change is needed indeed. Prof, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. We really value it as always. Much appreciated.